On the day my husband passed away, I said nothing about the $28 million inheritance or about the skyscraper in New York City under my name. That same night, my daughter-in-law screamed, "Pack your bags. The old leech doesn't stay here," I said. "Okay." Then I decided to do something that I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Pamela Roberts, and I'm 64 years old. On the day my husband James died, I thought the worst pain I could ever feel was losing the man I'd loved for 38 years. I was wrong. The worst pain came 12 hours later when his own family showed me exactly what they thought I was worth. The funeral had been everything James would have wanted: dignified, respectful, filled with people whose lives he'd touched. I sat in the front pew wearing my navy dress, the one he always said brought out my eyes, holding my composure like a shield. Everyone kept whispering about what a devoted wife I'd been, how I'd cared for him through those final months of illness without a single complaint. If only they knew the half of it: the sleepless nights, the quiet conversations when he was too weak to speak above a whisper, the gentle way I'd bathed him when he could no longer do it himself. Not because I had to, but because I wanted every moment I could get with the man who'd been my partner for nearly 4 decades. James's son Liam from his first marriage gave a beautiful eulogy. His daughter Emma read a poem. His eldest, Noah, shared memories that made people laugh through their tears. Even his ex-wife, Rebecca, managed to say something kind about the man who'd left her 20 years ago for me. I listened to it all, nodding when appropriate, accepting condolences with quiet grace. Everyone seemed to forget I wasn't just the second wife. I was the widow, the one who had to go home to an empty house filled with memories and silence. The reception afterward was held at our house. Well, what everyone assumed was our house. I watched as family members I barely knew picked through the photo albums, as distant cousins calculated the value of our furniture with their eyes. Emma's husband, Daniel, kept asking pointed questions about James's business affairs, while Noah's wife, Jessica, made comments about how much the house must be worth. But it was James's daughter-in-law, Ava Singh, who really caught my attention. She'd married our youngest, Liam, just 3 years ago, and from day one, she'd made it clear she thought I was taking up space in this family, a gold digger who'd married James for his money, even though she had no idea what his money actually was or where it came from. All day, she'd been watching me with this calculating look in her eyes. When I'd excuse myself to check on the catering, she'd be whispering with Emma in the corner. When I'd sit down for a moment to rest, the day had been exhausting. She'd give me these cold little smiles that made my skin crawl. The last guest left around 8:30. I was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher with shaking hands when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped right at the kitchen threshold. "Well, that's over with," Ava announced. I didn't turn around. I kept loading plates, focusing on the simple task to keep my grief from overwhelming me. "Thank you for helping organize everything," I said quietly. James would have appreciated it. "Cut the act, Pamela." Her voice was sharp, cutting. I finally turned around. Ava stood there with her arms crossed, still wearing her black dress, but having shed any pretense of mourning. Behind her, Liam shifted uncomfortably. Emma and Noah flanked them, creating what felt like a tribunal. "I'm sorry," I managed. Ava stepped closer. "The grieving widow routine. You can drop it now. We need to talk about practical matters." My hand stilled on the dishwasher. "What practical matters?" "This house, James's assets, the family business." She said each word like she was explaining something to a slow child. "Liam and I have discussed it with Emma and Noah. We think it's best if you start looking for your own place." The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. "My own place?" Emma cleared her throat. "What Ava means is this house is quite large for one person, and frankly, the upkeep costs alone." "Are you telling me to leave?" I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. Ava smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "I'm telling you to be realistic. You're 64 years old. Pamela, James took care of you while he was alive, but now you need to think about downsizing, finding something more appropriate to your situation." "My situation." My voice was steady despite the hammering of my heart. Well, you never worked. Did you? James provided everything? This house, your lifestyle, your security. But that was James's money. James's success. She gestured around the kitchen like she was already redecorating it in her mind. The family needs to make some hard decisions about his estate. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This is my home. I've lived here for 15 years. And it's been wonderful, I'm sure, Noah said, finally speaking up. But Dad would want us to be practical. There are 4 of us kids plus grandchildren to think about. College funds, retirement planning. James left a will. I said, yes, and we'll honor whatever small provision he made for you. Ava said dismissively. But let's be honest about what this is. You were his second wife, not his business partner. You didn't build anything together. You were just there. The words hit me like physical blows. Just there. After 38 years of marriage, after caring for him through cancer, after building a life together. I was just there. I think you should pack your things tonight. Ava continued. Liam and I can stay here to help manage the transition. It'll be easier for everyone if we handle James's affairs directly. I looked at Liam silently, pleading with him to defend me, to remember that I'd been his stepmother since he was 12 years old. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. Where am I supposed to go? I asked. Ava shrugged. There are some lovely senior communities around here, assisted living facilities. I'm sure you'll find something suitable. Assisted living like I was some helpless old woman who couldn't take care of herself. I stood there in my own kitchen, surrounded by people I'd considered family, and felt the last pieces of my heart break. The grief from losing James was nothing compared to this. This was betrayal. This was being erased from my own life. But as I looked at their faces, Ava's cruel satisfaction, the others' uncomfortable but determined expressions, something else began to grow alongside the pain. Something cold and quiet and patient. Deep inside me, where I'd always kept my strength hidden, I felt a familiar resolve. The same determination that had carried me through my first husband's death, through raising a child alone, through building an empire nobody knew about. Okay, I said simply. Ava blinked. Okay, I'll pack tonight. I'll be gone in the morning. The silence that followed was deafening. I think they'd expected me to fight, to beg, to make a scene that would justify their treatment of me. Instead, I turned back to the dishwasher and continued loading plates. Well, Ava said, clearly thrown off balance. Good. That's very mature of you. I didn't respond. I just kept working, listening as their footsteps retreated from the kitchen, as they began dividing up my life in hushed, excited whispers from the living room. They had no idea what they'd just done. They thought they were getting rid of a burden, claiming what was rightfully theirs. They thought James's widow was just an old woman with nowhere to go and nothing to fight with. They were about to learn how wrong they were. As I closed the dishwasher and listened to it hum to life, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Tomorrow my real life would begin. And theirs, well, theirs was about to get very, very complicated. I packed 2 suitcases that night. Just 2. Everything else, the jewelry, the artwork, the designer clothes Ava was probably already mentally cataloging, I left behind. Let them think it was all they were getting. Let them believe the grieving widow was walking away with nothing but some old dresses and memories. My hands shook as I folded James's favorite cardigan and placed it in my suitcase. Not from fear, but from a quiet rage I'd never allowed myself to feel before. I had spent decades playing a role: the supportive wife, the modest stepmother, the woman who seemed to have no ambitions beyond her family. It hadn't always been easy. There were moments when I'd wanted to correct someone's assumption that James was the sole provider, the business genius. Times when I'd been tempted to mention the properties I owned, the investments I managed, the empire I'd built long before I met him. But James had his pride, and I loved him enough to protect it. In public, he was the successful businessman, and I was his devoted wife. In private, we were equal partners who respected each other's strengths. That was the bargain we'd made, and I'd never regretted it. Until now, from the hallway, I could hear Ava's voice, sharp with excitement. The master bedroom needs a complete overhaul, she was saying. That furniture must be 20 years old, and those awful floral curtains had been handmade by James's mother. He'd kept them all these years out of sentiment, and I'd loved him too much to suggest changing them. What about her clothes? Emma's voice now, hesitant but curious. Should we donate them? Let's see if there's anything worth keeping first, Ava replied. Though I doubt it. She dresses like someone's grandmother. I am someone's grandmother, I thought, smiling despite myself. And those unfashionable clothes they were so quick to dismiss, many were bespoke pieces I'd had made in Paris and Milan, carefully selected to look expensive only to those who knew what to look for. What do you think Dad left her? Noah asked, his voice lower. Not much. Ava responded confidently. She signed a prenup, Liam told me. I had indeed signed a prenuptial agreement. One that protected my assets from James, not the other way around. But they didn't need to know that. Not yet. My phone buzzed with a text message. Harold Steinberg, my attorney for the past 18 years. All set for tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the Fairmont, Suite 812, Taipei. I texted back a simple thank you and continued packing. When I married James, I'd been a wealthy widow of 38 still mourning Michael, my first husband. Michael had left me with a substantial inheritance property in Manhattan, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, and a trust fund that generated more than enough for me to live comfortably. James never cared about my money. He had his own success, a modestly profitable consulting firm that he'd built from the ground up. We kept our finances largely separate, with a joint account for household expenses. It was simpler that way, and it allowed him to feel like he was providing for his family, which mattered to him. What James never fully understood was just how extensive my holdings had become over the years. The building I'd purchased in Soho for $2 million in 1995 was now worth $28 million. The apartment complexes I owned in Manhattan generated more rental income in a month than his consulting firm made in a year, and now his children, these entitled, ungrateful adults who'd just evicted me from my own home, were about to discover exactly who they'd been dismissing all these years. I zipped the second suitcase closed just as Liam appeared in the doorway. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like he used to do as a teenager when he'd done something wrong. Pamela. He started, then stopped. I looked at him, really looked at him. The boy I'd helped raise from age 12. The child who'd cried on my shoulder when his first girlfriend broke up with him. The young man whose college tuition I'd secretly paid when James's business had a difficult year. Yes, Liam, my voice was calm, betraying none of the hurt and anger churning inside me. I just wanted to say, this isn't personal. It's just, with Dad gone, we need to be practical about things. Practical, I repeated. Like making sure your stepmother has somewhere to sleep the night after her husband's funeral. He had the grace to look ashamed. Ava can be direct sometimes, but she has a point. This house is too big for one person, and we could help you find somewhere more appropriate for my age, I finished for him. Somewhere I can wither away quietly without inconveniencing anyone. It's exactly what you meant, I said, cutting him off. But don't worry. I've made arrangements. I'll be gone by morning, just like Ava wanted. Where will you go? There was a flicker of genuine concern in his voice, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Does it matter? I asked. He didn't answer. Of course it didn't matter. As long as I was out of their way, out of their lives, they could get on with the business of dividing up what they thought was theirs. Is there anything else, Liam? I asked when the silence had stretched too long. No, I guess not. He turned to leave, then stopped. Pamela, I am sorry. About Dad. In that moment, he looked so much like the boy I'd known that my resolve nearly cracked. But then I remembered his silence in the kitchen, how he'd stood behind his wife while she dismantled my life. Good night, Liam, I said after he left. I sat on the edge of my bed and allowed myself 5 minutes to cry, 5 minutes to grieve for James, for the life we'd built, for the family I thought I had. Then I dried my eyes, straightened my back, and made 3 phone calls. one to a car service for tomorrow morning, one to Margaret Chen at First National Bank, and one to a locksmith, one who specialized in emergency services and could come on very short notice. Because while I was willing to walk away tonight, I had no intention of staying away. Not from what was rightfully mine. The Hampton Inn on Route 1 became my temporary home, not exactly the Ritz, but it had a business center, reliable Wi-Fi, and most importantly, it was anonymous. I checked in under my maiden name, Pamela Morrison, and paid cash for a week. The desk clerk barely looked at me, just another senior citizen traveling alone, probably visiting grandchildren or attending a funeral. Perfect. Invisible was exactly what I needed to be right now. My room was clean and functional, if utterly devoid of personality. I set my suitcases by the closet but didn't bother unpacking. This wasn't home. This was a way station. A place to catch my breath and plan my next moves. The first call I made was to Harold Steinberg. Harold had been James's attorney for 25 years, but more than that, he'd been mine for the past 18. Not that anyone in James's family knew that, of course. They assumed I was just the wife, that Harold handled only James's affairs. Alberta. Harold's voice was warm when he answered. I'm so sorry for your loss. James was a good man. Thank you, Harold. I couldn't help but smile at the formality of his condolences. Harold knew exactly how close James and I had been. He'd drawn up the documents that had intertwined our lives in ways his family couldn't imagine. I need to see you tomorrow if possible. Of course, 10 o'clock. Actually, could we meet somewhere other than your office? Somewhere private? There was a pause. Harold had known me long enough to read between the lines. The family's giving you trouble. Something like that. I'll come to you. Text me the address. I hung up and immediately sent him the details of the hotel. Then I kicked off my shoes, lay back on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. Thinking, James and I had discussed what might happen after he was gone. We'd prepared legal documents, transferred assets, made sure everything was in order. What we hadn't anticipated was how quickly his children would turn on me, how eager they would be to erase me from their lives. My phone buzzed with a text from Liam. Hope you found a nice place. Ava's getting Dad's office organized. Found some business files we need to go through. I almost laughed out loud. Business files in James's study. If they only knew that James's real business files weren't in that house at all. They were in a safety deposit box downtown, along with property deeds, stock certificates, and documentation that would turn their world upside down. But let them look through his desk drawers and filing cabinets. Let them find his appointment books and client lists from the small consulting firm everyone thought was our only source of income. Let them calculate modest assets and plan modest inheritances. The truth would be so much more devastating when it came. I put the phone down without responding and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would be soon enough to begin dismantling the comfortable assumptions they'd built their plans upon. Harold arrived the next morning carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who'd dealt with family greed more times than he cared to count. I'd ordered coffee and pastries from room service, a small luxury that would have raised eyebrows if anyone had been watching. But that's the beauty of being invisible. No one watches you when they think you don't matter. How bad is it? Harold asked, settling into the room's single armchair. I told him about the previous night, about Ava's demands, about being told to find appropriate housing, about how they dismissed me as someone who'd never contributed anything to James's success. Harold's jaw tightened as I spoke. Do they have any idea about your actual situation? None whatsoever. James and I decided years ago that it was better that way. Let them think he was the business mogul, and I was just the pretty second wife. And you're sure you want to proceed as we discussed? I looked out the hotel window at the parking lot, at the ordinary cars filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. Yesterday they would have seen me as one of them, just another older woman, probably widowed, probably struggling. They had no idea that the woman in room 237 owned more property than most of them could imagine. I'm sure. How long will it take? Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. The preliminary transfers can be completed within 48 hours. The complete restructuring will take about 2 weeks. And there's no way they can contest it. Pamela, everything has been legally yours for over a decade. James transferred ownership years before his illness precisely to avoid situations like this. They can contest it all they want. They'll lose. I nodded, feeling that cold satisfaction settle deeper into my bones. What about the house? That's where it gets interesting. Harold allowed himself a small smile. Technically, you could evict them today, but I assume you have something more educational in mind. I want them to show me exactly who they are first. Let them get comfortable in my house, making their plans, dividing up what they think is theirs. Give them enough rope to hang themselves. And then I'll remind them that assumptions can be dangerous things. Harold spent the next hour walking me through documents, explaining procedures, confirming details that had been set in motion years ago. Most widows would be lost in the legal terminology, overwhelmed by the complexity of estate planning and asset management. But I wasn't most widows. After Harold left, I drove to the house, my house. I parked across the street and watched through tinted windows as moving trucks arrived. Ava directed workers like she was orchestrating a military campaign, pointing at James's study, gesturing toward the bedrooms. She'd brought her own furniture. I realized she wasn't just staying temporarily to handle affairs. She was moving in permanently. My phone buzzed. A text from Liam. Hope you found a nice place. Pamela, Ava's getting Dad's office organized. Found some business files we need to go through. I almost laughed out loud. Business files in James's study. If they only knew that James's real business files weren't in that house at all. They were in a safety deposit box downtown along with property deeds, stock certificates, and documentation that would turn their world upside down. But let them look through his desk drawers and filing cabinets. Let them find his appointment books and client lists from the small consulting firm everyone thought was our only source of income. Let them calculate modest assets and plan modest inheritances. The truth would be so much more devastating when it came. I drove downtown and spent the afternoon at First National, where I'd maintained accounts they knew nothing about. Margaret Chen, my personal banker, greeted me with professional sympathy. Mrs. Morrison, I was so sorry to hear about your husband's passing. How are you holding up? As well as can be expected. I need to make some account adjustments. Margaret nodded, probably assuming I needed to add James's name to survivor benefits or update beneficiary information. Instead, I handed her Harold's documentation. Her eyes widened as she read. Mrs. Morrison, these amounts, I had no idea you were working with such substantial assets. Privacy was important to my husband and me, I said quietly. But circumstances have changed. I can see that. When would you like these transfers to take effect? Immediately. As Margaret processed the paperwork, I thought about Ava back at the house, probably going through my closet, deciding which of my clothes were worth keeping. I thought about Liam and his siblings, likely meeting with financial advisors to discuss their father's estate. I thought about how they'd let Ava bully the woman who'd raised them. They thought they'd gotten rid of me. They thought the inconvenient widow was out of the way, leaving them free to claim their inheritance. They had no idea that they'd just picked a fight with someone who'd spent 38 years learning how to play the long game. My phone rang as I was signing the last of the transfer documents. Ava's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message with growing amusement. Pamela, we found some confusing paperwork in James's office. Legal documents that don't make sense. Could you call me back? There might be some things you need to explain. Confusing paperwork. I could only imagine what they'd found. Probably the outdated copies James kept for show. Documents that referenced assets that no longer existed under his name. They were getting nervous, realizing that their father's financial picture wasn't as clear-cut as they'd assumed. I deleted the message without responding. Let them wonder. Let them worry. Let them spend sleepless nights trying to figure out why nothing added up the way they'd expected. Tomorrow, I would start phase 2 of my plan. Tonight, I would have dinner in my anonymous hotel room and watch the news like any other senior citizen spending the evening alone. But I wasn't alone. Not really. I had Harold. I had Margaret. I had a network of professionals who'd been quietly managing my affairs for years. And most importantly, I had time. Ava and her allies thought they'd won a quick victory. They had no idea they'd just declared war on someone who'd been preparing for this battle longer than they'd been part of this family. The grieving widow was done grieving. Now it was time for the real Pamela Morrison Roberts to emerge from the shadows. And when she did, the family that had dismissed her so easily would learn that some assumptions cost more than others. 3 days had passed since I'd moved into the Hampton Inn, and I could tell the family was getting restless. My phone had been buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from Ava, each one more demanding than the last. She wanted me to come back and explain some discrepancies they'd found in James's paperwork. She needed me to sign documents. She had questions only I could answer. I ignored them all. Instead, I spent my mornings in the hotel's business center, making calls that would have shocked them senseless. Tuesday, I spoke with the property management company that handled my 3 apartment complexes in Manhattan. Miss Morrison, the West 72nd Street renovations are coming along nicely. Daniel Ross, my property manager, reported. The contractors expect to be finished by the end of next month. Once complete, we can increase rents by approximately 15%, which should boost your monthly income by about $42,000. Yeah, I see. Excellent, I replied. And the commercial space on the ground floor. We have 3 interested parties. I've scheduled meetings with each of them next week. Keep me updated, I said, making notes in a small leather-bound notebook I'd carried in my purse for decades. The same notebook James's children had probably seen me writing in countless times, never once asking what I was recording. They'd assumed it was grocery lists or doctor's appointments. In reality, it was the careful accounting of an empire. Wednesday, I had a conference call with my investment advisor about moving some assets around. The tech stock sell-off has created some buying opportunities. Elizabeth Wolfe told me, with your cash reserves, we could take significant positions in several undervalued companies. Do it. I authorized. Use up to $5 million of the liquid assets. There was no hesitation on her part, no surprise at the amount. Elizabeth had been managing portions of my portfolio for over a decade. To her, I was never just James's wife. I was a client with serious financial acumen and the assets to match. Thursday, I spent 2 hours on the phone with architects about renovation plans for the building I owned in Soho, my little secret that even James hadn't fully understood the value of when I'd bought it 15 years ago, with money from my first marriage. Back then, it had been a rundown warehouse in a neighborhood nobody wanted. Now, it was worth $28 million, and the rent from the high-end lofts I'd created generated more income in a month than James's consulting firm had made in a year. But they didn't know any of that. To them, I was still just the second wife who'd never worked a day in her life. My phone rang again. Liam this time, not Ava. I almost declined the call, but curiosity got the better of me. Hello, Liam? Pamela. His voice was strained. Where are you staying? We've been trying to reach you. I'm sure you have. I kept my voice neutral. I found a place, just like Ava wanted. Look, we need to talk. We found some documents in Dad's study that don't make sense. There are references to properties and accounts we can't locate, and his attorney won't meet with us without you present. I smiled at that. Harold was playing his part perfectly. That sounds very confusing for you, I said. Pamela, please, this isn't a game. We're trying to settle Dad's affairs. Are you? Or are you trying to divide up what you think he left behind? The question hung between us like a blade. There was a long pause. It's not like that. Isn't it because it certainly seemed that way when your wife told me to pack my bags and find assisted living? Ava can be direct. He sounded uncomfortable. But we really do need your help sorting this out. I could have told him then. I could have explained exactly why Harold wouldn't meet with them. Why the documents didn't make sense. Why they couldn't find the assets they thought they'd inherit. But that would have been too easy. Too quick. They hadn't earned the truth yet. I'll think about it, I said. But right now I need some time to myself. Dad left you the beach house, you know, he said suddenly. The one in Florida. We found the deed. I nearly laughed out loud. The beach house was a modest condo I'd purchased a decade ago under James's name, using it as our vacation home. It was worth maybe $400,000 pocket change compared to my actual holdings. But to them, it probably seemed like a generous bequest. "How considerate," I said. "I'll be sure to visit it sometime." I hung up before he could say more and made my final call of the day to the Fairmont Hotel downtown. It was time to upgrade my accommodations. If they wanted to meet, if they wanted answers, they could come to me on my terms. And I wanted those terms to make a statement. Yes, I'd like to book the penthouse suite. I told the reservation agent, for one night, to start. The penthouse at the Fairmont wasn't the most expensive in the city, but at $5,000 a night, it sent a message. More importantly, it had a formal dining area that could seat 12 people, perfect for the meeting Harold was arranging. As I packed my 2 suitcases, I felt a shift in my resolve. The grief that had nearly overwhelmed me at James's funeral was still there, a dull ache in my chest that flared whenever I thought of him. But alongside it now was something else, a clarity of purpose that felt almost liberating. For decades, I'd played a role, downplaying my business acumen, my financial independence, my strength. I'd done it out of love for James, out of respect for his pride. But James was gone now, and his family had made it abundantly clear that they saw no value in me beyond whatever assets they thought I might be withholding. It was time they learned exactly who they were dealing with. Not just James's widow, not just the stepmother they could dismiss so easily, but Pamela Morrison Roberts, a woman who had built her first fortune before they were even out of elementary school. I checked out of the Hampton Inn at precisely noon, leaving a generous tip for the housekeeping staff. The drive to the Fairmont took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing a boundary between worlds. Behind me, the anonymity I'd wrapped myself in since James's death. Ahead, the reckoning his family had brought upon themselves. The hotel staff greeted me with the deference reserved for their most valuable guests, escorting me to the penthouse suite with its panoramic views of the city. As I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the skyline James and I had both loved, I felt his absence acutely. "I wish you could see this," I whispered to the empty room. "I wish you could see what they did. What I'm about to do." My phone rang again. Harold this time. "It's set," he said without preamble. "Monday afternoon, 2:00 p.m. They've hired an attorney, Jackson Porter, from Porter & Associates." "Have they now?" I moved away from the window, settling into a plush armchair. "He's asking questions about James's estate. Apparently, the family has some concerns about asset distribution and wants to ensure everything is being handled properly." I set down my coffee cup, feeling that familiar cold satisfaction spread through my chest. How proper of them to be concerned. There's more. They're requesting a formal reading of the will. They want all beneficiaries present, including you. At their attorney's office, I assume that was their request, yes. Decline it. I said, if they want a formal reading, it happens here, at the Fairmont, and I want Catherine Walsh as my representation. Harold was quiet for a moment. "Catherine Walsh, she's one of the most aggressive estate attorneys in the state." "Exactly. It's time to stop playing defense. Harold, arrange it. Pamela, are you sure you're ready for this? Once we walk into that room, there's no going back. They're going to learn exactly who you are." I looked out at the city again, at people going about their ordinary lives with ordinary problems. Soon, very soon, I would no longer be invisible to the family that had dismissed me so easily. "Harold, I've been ready for 15 years. That weekend, I went shopping, not at the discount stores they probably expected a newly poor widow to frequent, but at the boutiques I'd always preferred. I chose a navy blue Armani suit, elegant but understated, along with my grandmother's pearl necklace and the Cartier watch James had given me for our 10th anniversary. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a woman of substance who had simply chosen to be underestimated. Sunday evening, I ordered room service lobster and champagne and reviewed the documents Harold had prepared. Everything was in order. Everything was legal. Everything was about to change. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully, applied my makeup with precision, and arranged for the hotel to set up the dining room for the afternoon meeting. At 1:30, Harold arrived with Catherine Walsh, a tall, sharp-featured woman with the kind of presence that commanded attention the moment she walked into a room. "Mrs. Roberts," she said, extending her hand. "I've reviewed your situation thoroughly. You've been very strategic in your asset management." "Thank you, Miss Walsh. I'm hoping today will be educational for everyone involved." She smiled thinly. "I imagine it will be." At precisely 2:00 p.m., the front desk called to announce the arrival of the rest of the party. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and nodded to Harold. "Show them in." The conference room of the penthouse suite had been arranged with meticulous care. A large mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a silent testament to wealth and power that wasn't lost on anyone who entered. I sat at the head of the table, with Harold to my right and Catherine Walsh to my left. We were the first to arrive, positioned like generals planning a campaign. The battle lines had been drawn long before James's children even knew there was a war. They entered as a group, Liam and Ava first, followed by Emma and her husband Daniel, then Noah and his wife Jessica. Behind them came a soft-looking man in his 50s, who I assumed was Jackson Porter. They all paused momentarily at the threshold, taking in the opulent surroundings with varying degrees of surprise. Ava recovered first, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the room, the view, the obvious expense. "Well," she said with forced brightness, "this is quite the setting for a family meeting." "I thought we should all be comfortable," I replied mildly. "Please, take a seat." They arranged themselves on the opposite side of the table, unconsciously creating the very dynamic I'd anticipated them versus me, with the attorneys as intermediaries. Ava positioned herself directly across from me, flanked by Liam and Emma, with Noah slightly behind them. Jackson Porter mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Mrs. Roberts, thank you for arranging this meeting. I'm Jackson Porter, representing the Holloway family in matters pertaining to James Holloway's estate." "Mr. Porter," I nodded slightly. "This is Harold Steinberg, who has been James's attorney for 25 years, and Catherine Walsh, who will be representing my interests today." Porter's eyes widened slightly at Catherine's name, but he recovered quickly. "Shall we begin?" "Please do," I said. He cleared his throat and began reading James's will in a monotone voice that suggested he'd done this hundreds of times before. The standard language about being of sound mind, the formal declarations, the preliminary bequests to charity. Then came the part they'd been waiting for. "To my beloved children, Noah, Emma, and Liam, I leave the sum of $50,000 each to be distributed equally among them." I watched their faces carefully. $50,000 each was generous for most families, but it was far less than they'd expected. Ava's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Emma frowned. Noah leaned forward like he'd misheard. "And to my dear wife, Pamela Morrison Roberts, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business interests, to be hers absolutely and without restriction." The silence that followed was deafening. Jackson Porter continued reading, but I could see that no one was listening anymore. They were all staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to outrage to disbelief. "Excuse me," Ava interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Could you repeat that last part?" Jackson Porter looked uncomfortable. "The bulk of Mr. Roberts's estate goes to his widow, as is customary in such circumstances." "But what exactly does that include?" Emma asked, her voice rising. "The house, his business. What are we talking about here?" It was Catherine Walsh who answered, consulting her own copy of the will with professional detachment. "According to these documents, Mrs. Roberts inherits all real property, all financial accounts, all business assets, and all personal property not specifically mentioned elsewhere in the will." "That's impossible," Noah said flatly. "Dad would never leave us with just $50,000 each." Harold leaned forward slightly. "I'm afraid it's quite legal, Mr. Roberts. Your father was very specific about his intentions." "But she didn't earn any of it," Ava exploded, finally losing the composure she'd been struggling to maintain. "She never worked. She never contributed anything. She was just there, living off his success. The words hung in the air like poison. Just there. The same phrase she'd used the night she'd thrown me out of my own home. The same dismissal. The same contempt. The same fundamental misunderstanding of who I really was. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room focus on me. For 38 years, I had let James be the face of our success. I had allowed people to assume he was the business mind while I played the supporting wife. I had been content to remain in the shadows, building my empire quietly while he took the credit publicly. But James was gone now, and the shadows had served their purpose. "You're absolutely right, Ava," I said quietly. "I never contributed anything to James's success." She blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. James's consulting firm, his modest investments, his reputation in the community, that was all him. I had nothing to do with any of it. I could see confusion rippling across their faces. This wasn't the response they'd expected. "But you see," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "James's estate isn't what you think it is, and I'm not who you think I am." Catherine Walsh was already reaching into her briefcase, pulling out documents that would change everything. Harold was checking his watch, timing the moment perfectly. "What do you mean?" Liam asked, speaking for the first time since the reading began. I looked at each of them in turn. These people who had dismissed me, who had thrown me out of my own home, who had treated me like a burden to be disposed of. "I mean," I said, allowing myself the smallest smile, "that you've been operating under some very expensive assumptions about who owns what in this family." Catherine Walsh opened her briefcase with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The documents she withdrew were organized in neat folders, each one labeled with the kind of detail that suggested this moment had been planned for a very long time. "Perhaps," Catherine said in her crisp, professional voice, "we should clarify exactly what constitutes James Roberts' estate." Jackson Porter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "The question," Harold interjected, "is whether James actually owned the assets that his family believes they're inheriting." I watched Ava's face carefully. The confident smirk she'd worn since entering the room was beginning to crack around the edges. "Of course, he owned them," she said, but there was a new uncertainty in her voice. "The house, the business, everything. Pamela never worked, never contributed financially." "That's where you're wrong," Catherine interrupted, sliding the first document across the polished table. "Mrs. Roberts has been the primary owner of virtually every significant asset in this family for over 15 years. The paper landed in front of Ava with a soft whisper that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. She stared at it like it might bite her. "This is the deed to the property at 47 Elm Street," Catherine continued. "The house you've been living in since Mrs. Roberts graciously vacated it. Notice the name on the title." Ava picked up the document with trembling fingers. Her face went white as she read. "Pamela Morrison," she whispered. "That's correct. The house was transferred to Mrs. Roberts' sole ownership in 2008, 5 years after their marriage. Mr. Roberts retained lifetime occupancy rights, but ownership transferred completely upon his death." Emma grabbed the paper from Ava's hands, scanning it frantically. "This has to be a mistake. Dad bought that house before he even met her." "He did," Harold confirmed. "And then he refinanced it in 2007 using capital that Mrs. Roberts provided when the new mortgage was issued. Ownership transferred to her as the primary financial backer." "What capital?" Noah demanded. "She never had any money." Catherine smiled, a cold, professional expression that reminded me why I'd hired her. "Mrs. Roberts has had considerable assets since before her marriage to your father. She simply chose not to advertise that fact. I had been quiet long enough. These people had spent the last week living in my house, planning their futures based on my assets, treating me like a discarded inconvenience. It was time for them to understand exactly who they'd been dismissing." "The money came from my first marriage," I said calmly. "When my first husband died in 1995, he left me quite well provided for. Real estate investments, stock portfolios, life insurance. I was 38 years old and financially independent when I met your father. The silence in the room was deafening. But you never worked, Liam said weakly, like he was clinging to the last piece of his worldview. I didn't need to work in the traditional sense. I managed investments. I bought and sold properties. I made business decisions. I gestured toward Catherine, who was already preparing the next folder. I just did it quietly. Catherine slid a new set of documents across the table. These are the ownership papers for Morrison Holdings LLC, established in 1996. Mrs. Roberts is the sole proprietor of a company that owns 17 properties across 3 states. Ava's hand flew to her throat. 17 properties, including 3 apartment complexes in Manhattan, 2 office buildings in Boston, and a recently renovated warehouse in Soho that was just appraised at $28 million. The number hit the room like a physical force. I watched as the implications sank in, as their understanding of reality shifted and cracked. $28 million. Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. That's just one property, Harold added helpfully. Would you like to see the complete portfolio? He didn't wait for an answer. Document after document appeared on the table like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Bank statements showing accounts with balances that made James's modest savings look like pocket change. Investment records detailing stock holdings in companies they'd never heard of. Property deeds from Maine to Florida. The total value of Mrs. Roberts's holdings, Catherine announced, consulting her summary sheet, is approximately $47 million, not including the assets she inherited from James's estate, which, as we've established, amount to roughly $300,000 in business assets and personal effects. $47 million. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ava was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just shock, but something approaching terror. You're lying, she said, but her voice had no conviction behind it. Which part would I be lying about? I asked pleasantly. The part where I've been financially independent since before I met James, or the part where you've been living in my house for the past week. But why didn't Dad ever say anything? Noah asked, looking genuinely confused. Because I asked him not to. James had his pride. He wanted to be seen as the provider, the successful businessman. I was happy to let him have that image publicly while I handled things privately. So when we asked you to leave, Liam said slowly, you were actually... I was being evicted from my own home by people who had no legal right to be there. The truth of what they'd done was finally sinking in. I could see it in their faces. The growing horror as they realized they hadn't just been cruel to a helpless widow. They'd been cruel to someone who could destroy them financially without breaking a sweat. The business cards you found in James's office, Catherine continued, clearly enjoying their distress, were for a consulting firm that Mr. Roberts operated as essentially a hobby. It generated maybe $40,000 a year in revenue, hardly enough to support the lifestyle you all assumed he was funding. Then how did he pay for everything? Emma asked. He didn't, I said simply. I did. The mortgage on the house, the property taxes, the utilities, the insurance, all of it came from my accounts. James contributed his consulting income, which covered groceries and incidentals. Ava was shaking now, visibly trembling as the full scope of her mistake became clear. You let us think. I let you reveal exactly who you were, I corrected. I didn't force you to throw me out of my own house. I didn't make you call me a bloodsucker in Hindi. I didn't tell you to treat a grieving widow with contempt and cruelty. The word bloodsucker, a term Ava had used thinking I wouldn't understand, made her flinch. I gave you every opportunity to show kindness, to include me in your family, to treat me with basic human dignity. Instead, you showed me your true character. Jackson Porter was looking around the room like he'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. I think there may be some misunderstanding here about the nature of these assets. There's no misunderstanding, Harold said firmly. Everything is documented, legal, and has been properly maintained for years. Mrs. Roberts was under no obligation to disclose her financial situation to her stepchildren. But what does this mean for us? Noah asked, his voice small and frightened. Catherine consulted her papers with theatrical precision. Well, legally speaking, you each inherit exactly what your father left you. $50,000. As for your current living situation, she looked directly at Ava. You're currently residing in Mrs. Roberts's property without her permission. That would technically make you trespassers. The word trespassers hit like a slap. Ava's face cycled through several colors before settling on a sickly gray. You can't be serious, she whispered. I'm completely serious, I said, standing up slowly. You wanted me out of the way so you could claim what you thought was rightfully yours. You succeeded in getting me out of the way. Unfortunately for you, nothing was rightfully yours to begin with. I gathered my purse and looked at each of them one final time, these people who had treated me like garbage, who had dismissed my grief and my worth, who had tried to erase me from my own life. I'll give you 72 hours to remove your belongings from my house, I said quietly. After that, I'll have you legally evicted. As I walked toward the door, Ava's voice followed me, high and desperate. Pamela, please, we can work something out. We're family. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the doorknob. Family, I repeated softly. You know, Ava, you're absolutely right. We are family. And you've just taught me exactly what that word means to you. I walked out of that conference room knowing that my old life was over. The invisible widow was gone forever. In her place stood someone they should have been much more careful about crossing. The real reckoning was just beginning. The 72 hours I'd given them turned into the most satisfying 3 days of my life. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, I'm not cruel by nature, but because for the first time in decades, I was watching people face the real consequences of their choices. The first call came 6 hours after the meeting. Ava, of course, her voice a mixture of desperation and barely contained rage. Pamela, we need to talk. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. I was in my penthouse suite at the Fairmont, enjoying a glass of wine and watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold. I thought we talked quite thoroughly this afternoon. You know what I mean. The house, the money, all of it. There has to be some way to work this out reasonably. Reasonably. I let the word hang in the air. Like how you reasonably threw me out of my own home the night my husband died. Silence on the other end. Then, we were grieving too. Pamela, we weren't thinking clearly. You were thinking clearly enough to have me pack my bags and find somewhere else to live within hours of James's funeral. You were thinking clearly enough to start dividing up what you thought was your inheritance. But we're family. No, Ava, you made it very clear that I'm not family. You called me a bloodsucker. Remember, a parasite who never contributed anything. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She hadn't expected me to understand the Hindi insult. I didn't mean, you meant exactly what you said. The only thing you didn't mean was for me to be in a position to do anything about it. I ended the call and blocked her number. The next morning brought Liam to my hotel. The concierge called up to announce him, asking if I wanted to receive visitors. I almost said no, but curiosity got the better of me. Liam had always been the weakest of James's children, the one most easily led by stronger personalities. I wanted to see how he'd handle the situation when his wife couldn't speak for him. He sat across from me in the hotel's elegant lobby, wringing his hands like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. The man was 35 years old, but he looked like he might cry. Pamela, I'm so sorry about everything. Ava gets carried away sometimes, and I should have stopped her. Should have, could have, would have, I said calmly. But you didn't? I know, and I regret that. But you have to understand, we thought Dad had left us provided for. We thought the house, the business, everything would be ours to share. And when you thought that, your first instinct was to throw me out onto the street. Liam's face flushed. It wasn't like that. We just thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, more manageable. Liam, my voice was sharp enough to cut through his rambling. Stop lying to me and to yourself. You wanted me gone so you could have everything without having to consider my needs or feelings. He stared at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. Ava said terrible things. Yes, but you stood there and let her. You could have defended me. You could have reminded her that I'd been your stepmother for over 20 years, that I'd raised you from the time you were 12 years old. Instead, You watched her humiliate a grieving woman and said nothing. I'm saying something now, he whispered. Now that you know I don't need your charity. Now that you realize I'm not the helpless widow you can discard. Your apology isn't about remorse. Liam, it's about fear. He looked up then, and I saw that I was right. His eyes were filled with terror. What are you going to do to us? The question hung between us like a blade. What was I going to do? I had the power to destroy them financially, to make their lives as difficult as they'd tried to make mine. I owned properties they could never afford, had connections they couldn't imagine. I could make them suffer in ways they couldn't even comprehend. But looking at Liam weak, frightened Liam, who'd never had an original thought in his adult life, I realized something. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted something much more valuable than revenge. I wanted them to learn. I'm going to do exactly what I said I would do. You have until tomorrow evening to remove your belongings from my house. After that, I'm changing the locks. And then, I paused, making sure he was listening, really listening. Then you're going to figure out how to live your own lives, make your own decisions, and face your own consequences. No more depending on family money that was never really family money to begin with. Liam's shoulders sagged. Ava is going to lose her mind. Ava is going to learn that actions have consequences, just like you are. He left without another word, and I watched him walk away, knowing that this conversation had changed something fundamental between us. Not forgiveness that would take time, if it ever came at all, but understanding. The final 24 hours were the most interesting. I had Harold arrange for a locksmith to be ready, and I drove to the house, my house at exactly 6:00 on Friday evening, to see if they'd honored the deadline. The driveway was full of cars, not just Liam and Ava's vehicles, but Noah's truck, Emma's sedan, even some cars I didn't recognize. As I sat in my rental car watching the house, I realized they were having some sort of family meeting about me, presumably about what to do with the problem I'd become. I walked to the front door and used my key. They hadn't thought to change the locks, probably because it had never occurred to them that I might still have one. The voices from the living room stopped abruptly when they heard the door open. "Hello?" I called out pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind me letting myself in. It is my house, after all." I found them arranged around the living room like a war council. Ava sat in what had been James's favorite chair, still playing the role of matriarch. Noah and Emma flanked her while Liam hung back near the window. There were two people I didn't recognize, a middle-aged couple who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Pamela," Ava said, standing up with forced dignity. "We were hoping you'd come by. We wanted to discuss a reasonable settlement to this whole misunderstanding." "Settlement?" I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For the house. Obviously, Liam and I have put a lot of work into this place. A lot of improvements. We think we deserve some compensation for... You think you deserve compensation for living in my house rent-free for a week." The unknown couple exchanged glances. The woman cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps we should go. Ava, this seems like a private family matter." "No, please stay," I said warmly. "I'm Pamela Roberts, James's widow, and you are Vikram and Priya Singh," the man said reluctantly. We're Ava's parents." Ah, so they'd brought in reinforcements. Ava's parents had probably been told some version of events that painted me as the villain in this story. "How lovely to meet you. I hope Ava has explained the situation accurately." Priya Singh looked between her daughter and me with obvious confusion. She said there was some sort of dispute about James's will. About who gets what. "There's no dispute," I said calmly. "The will is very clear. James left modest bequests to his children and everything else to me. The only complication is that most of what people assumed was James's property was actually mine all along." Vikram Singh frowned. "I'm sorry. I don't understand." Neither did they until a few days ago. "You see, I've been financially independent since before I married James. The house they've been living in belongs to me. The comfortable lifestyle they've been enjoying was funded by my assets, not James's." I watched the older couple process this information, watched their expressions change as they realized their daughter might not have been entirely truthful about the circumstances. "But Ava said you never worked," Priya said slowly. I didn't need to work in the traditional sense. I managed a rather substantial investment portfolio. I smiled pleasantly. About $47 million worth, as it turns out. The silence that followed was profound. Vikram Singh's mouth actually fell open. So, when your daughter threw me out of this house the night James died, I continued conversationally, she was essentially evicting me from my own property. When she called me a bloodsucker who never contributed anything, she was speaking to someone who had been supporting the entire family for years. Ava's face had gone white. Her parents were staring at her with expressions of horror and disbelief. Ava Marie Singh, her mother said in the tone of voice that probably hadn't been used since Ava was 12 years old. Please tell me you didn't actually throw this woman out of her own house at her husband's funeral. It's complicated, Mom. It's not complicated at all, I said gently. Your daughter made assumptions about my financial situation and treated me accordingly. She's now learning that assumptions can be expensive. Vikram Singh stood up, his face red with embarrassment. Mrs. Roberts, on behalf of our family, I want to apologize if Ava did what you're saying. Dad, don't. If she treated you that way during your time of grief, then she was raised better than that and should know better. He looked at his daughter with disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. We're leaving, Priya. This isn't something we want to be part of. As Ava's parents gathered their things and headed for the door, I could see the final pillar of her support system crumbling. She'd counted on them to back her up, to see her as the victim in this situation. Instead, they'd seen her for what she really was. 20 minutes, I announced to the room as the front door closed behind the Singhs. Then I'm changing the locks whether you're finished or not. They scrambled then, grabbing bags and boxes they'd obviously packed in preparation for this confrontation. Noah and Emma avoided eye contact as they carried their belongings to their cars. Liam moved like a man in a trance, but Ava stood in the center of the living room, staring at me with something approaching hatred. This isn't over, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. Equally quiet. It is. She left without another word, and I watched from the window as the cars pulled out of my driveway one by one. When the last tail light disappeared around the corner, I called Harold. It's done, I told him. They're gone. How do you feel? I considered the question as I walked through my house, really looked at it for the first time since James's death. It felt different now, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from the very walls. I feel free, I said finally, and for the first time in a week, that was absolutely true. 6 months after that final confrontation, I was sitting in my garden watching the sunrise paint my roses pink and gold when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. These days, I was much more selective about who I allowed into my peaceful mornings, but the number looked familiar, and curiosity won out over caution. Mrs. Roberts, this is Dr. Elizabeth Chen at Mercy General Hospital. I have a patient here asking for you. My blood ran cold. Who? Liam Roberts. He's listed you as his emergency contact. Emergency contact. After everything that had happened, after the way his family had treated me, Liam had still listed me as the person to call in a crisis. Despite myself, I felt a familiar pang of maternal concern. What happened? Car accident. He's stable, but he's asking for you specifically. Said to tell you it's important. 20 minutes later, I was walking through the sterile corridors of Mercy General, my heels clicking against the polished floor. I'd changed out of my gardening clothes into something more appropriate, a simple blue dress that James had always liked, paired with the pearl earrings he'd given me for our anniversary. I found Liam in a private room, his left leg in a cast and his arm in a sling, but otherwise looking remarkably well for someone who'd apparently wrapped his car around a tree. Pamela. His voice was soft, relieved. You came. Of course I came. You're hurt. The words came automatically, surprising me with their sincerity. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that cared what happened to this man I'd helped raise. He tried to sit up straighter and winced. The nurse said they couldn't reach Ava. Her phone's been disconnected. I wasn't surprised. In the months since they'd been forced out of my house, I'd heard through the small-town gossip network that Liam and Ava's marriage had imploded spectacularly. Apparently, Learning that your financial security was built on lies and assumptions had put considerable strain on their relationship. Where is she now? I asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed. Gone. She left 3 months ago, took what was left of our savings and moved back in with her parents. Liam stared at the ceiling, his voice hollow. She said she married me for the lifestyle, not for me. When the lifestyle disappeared, I'm sorry, Liam. Are you? He turned to look at me, and I was startled by the clarity in his eyes. Even after everything we did to you, I considered the question seriously. Was I sorry 6 months ago? I would have said that Ava leaving was exactly what Liam deserved. But looking at him now, broken, alone, finally forced to confront the consequences of his choices, I found that I was genuinely sad for him. Yes, I said simply, I'm sorry you're going through this. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the hospital around us. Finally, Liam spoke again. I need to tell you something about that night when Ava threw you out. Liam, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was stronger now, more determined than I'd heard it in years. I knew it was wrong. Even as it was happening, I knew it was cruel and unfair. But I was so angry about the will, so disappointed that Dad had left us so little, that I let Ava convince me you were the problem. He paused, struggling with words that had obviously been weighing on him for months. You raised me, Pamela, from the time I was 12 years old. You were more of a mother to me than my biological mother ever was. You came to my soccer games, helped me with homework, stayed up with me when I was sick. And the night Dad died, when I should have been protecting you and comforting you, I let my wife call you names and throw you out onto the street. Tears were sliding down his cheeks now, and I felt my own throat tighten with emotion. I've been living with that guilt for 6 months, and I needed you to know that I remember who you really are, not the rich woman with all the power, though God knows I understand that now, too. But the woman who bandaged my scraped knees and taught me how to drive, and never once made me feel like I was less important than her biological children. I reached over and took his uninjured hand in mine. Oh, Liam, I don't expect you to forgive me. He continued. I just needed you to know that I see now what I threw away. Not the money or the inheritance or any of that. I threw away the one person in my life who loved me unconditionally. The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. You didn't throw me away, honey. You made a mistake. A terrible, hurtful mistake. But not an unforgivable one. He squeezed my hand weakly. How can you say that after what we did? Because I understand something now that I didn't 6 months ago. That night when Ava threw me out, I thought my world was ending. I thought I was losing my family, my home, everything that mattered. But what I was really losing was an illusion. Liam frowned, not understanding. I thought I was part of a loving family where everyone cared about each other. But the truth was, I was part of a system where my value was based on what I could provide, not who I was. That night forced me to see the difference. I adjusted my grip on his hand, choosing my words carefully. You and your siblings and Ava, you didn't know me at all. You knew the role I played, the function I served. But you never bothered to find out who I really was underneath. And because you didn't know me, you couldn't really love me. You loved what I did for you. Liam was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. And now, I continued, now you're seeing me for the first time as a complete person, someone with her own history, her own strength, her own worth that exists independently of what I can do for others. And I'm seeing you clearly, too, Liam, not as James's son or Ava's husband, but as the young man I helped raise who's finally learning to take responsibility for his choices. So, where does that leave us? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the doctor's call that morning. Where did it leave us? I had every right to walk away from this family permanently. I had every justification for letting them live with the consequences of their cruelty without interference from me. But sitting in that hospital room, holding the hand of the boy I'd helped raise, I realized that revenge and justice weren't the same thing. Justice had been served. They'd learned the truth about their assumptions and faced the natural consequences. Revenge would be withholding forgiveness from someone who was genuinely trying to make amends. It leaves us here, I said finally. Starting over, if you want to, building a relationship based on who we actually are instead of who we thought we were supposed to be. Liam's eyes filled with fresh tears. You'd be willing to do that after everything? I'd be willing to try, but it would be different this time. Liam, I'm not going to be the invisible woman who makes everything work behind the scenes. I'm not going to pretend to be less than I am to make other people comfortable. I wouldn't want you to. And I'm not going to rescue you from the consequences of your choices. If you want a relationship with me, you have to build it yourself, maintain it yourself, and value it for what it is, not for what it might get you. Liam nodded solemnly. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't about money or inheritance or anything material. This is about two adults choosing to care about each other despite a very painful history. I know, and I want that. Pamela, I want to know you, the real you, not the version I created in my head. I studied his face, looking for any sign that this was manipulation or desperation talking. But what I saw was something I'd never seen from Liam before, genuine remorse and a determination to do better. Then we'll try, I said slowly, carefully. With clear boundaries and honest communication, relief washed over his features. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be hard work. Liam, unlearning 30 years of bad habits and assumptions isn't easy. I'm ready for hard work. These past 6 months have taught me I'm stronger than I thought I was. I squeezed his hand one more time, then stood up to leave. I'm going to go talk to your doctor about your discharge plans. Do you have somewhere to go when you get out of here? I've been staying in a studio apartment downtown. It's not much, but it's mine. Good. Independence suits you. As I walked toward the door, Liam's voice stopped me. Pamela, what about Emma and Noah? Do you think? I turned back to him. That's up to them, honey. My door is open, but they have to choose to walk through it, just like you did. And Ava. I considered this. Ava, who had initiated the cruelty that started this whole mess. Ava, who had shown no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing, only anger at being caught in her assumptions. Ava burned that bridge herself, I said quietly. Some actions have consequences that can't be undone. She chose to reveal her character, and now she has to live with what she revealed. Liam nodded, understanding the distinction. I left him there in his hospital bed, looking more peaceful than I'd seen him since he was a child. The walk back to my car felt different somehow, lighter, like I was carrying less weight than when I'd walked in. 3 weeks after Liam's accident, I invited him to dinner at my home. It was the first time any of James's children had been back since that final confrontation 6 months ago, and I could feel the tension in Liam's shoulders as he walked up the driveway. He looked different, thinner, certainly. His clothes a bit more worn than the designer labels Ava had insisted on, but there was something else, too. A new steadiness in his gaze that suggested he was finally growing into the man his father had always hoped he'd become. Thank you for inviting me, he said, handing me a modest bouquet of flowers as he stepped through the door. Not roses or orchids, but wildflowers, the kind I'd always preferred, but that James's family had never noticed. They're beautiful. I meant it. Not because the flowers themselves were particularly extraordinary, but because they represented something important Liam seeing me as I was, not as he'd assumed I was. Dinner was simple roast chicken, roasted vegetables, a crusty bread that I'd baked myself that morning. Not the elaborate meals I used to prepare for family gatherings. Trying to impress. Trying to earn my place at the table. This was honest food, meant for honest conversation. I saw Noah yesterday, Liam said as I poured him a glass of wine. He asked about you. And what did you tell him? The truth, that you're doing well, that you're still the kindest person I know despite everything we put you through, and that if he wants to be part of your life again, he needs to make the effort. I raised an eyebrow. That was direct. I'm learning that honesty saves everyone a lot of time. He took a sip of wine. He's struggling. The consulting firm is barely staying afloat. Turns out Dad was the one with all the client relationships. Noah's good at the technical side, but he can't bring in business the way Dad did. And Emma, back in school, actually, she's getting her teaching credential. Said she always wanted to work with kids, but got sidetracked trying to live up to Dad's expectations. I nodded, not surprised. Emma had always had a gentleness about her that seemed at odds with the corporate world James had pushed her toward. And you, how's the new job? After recovering from his injuries, Liam had taken a position at a local nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth. It paid a fraction of what he'd earned at his father's firm, but from the way his eyes lit up when he talked about it, I could tell it fed something in his soul that money never had. It's challenging, but in all the right ways. The kids are tough but honest. They can spot a fake a mile away, so I can't hide behind the facade I used to wear. They force me to be real. Like the way you're being real with me now. He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Exactly like that. It turns out authenticity is exhausting, but worth it. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing, about James and the life we'd shared, about Liam's childhood memories, some of which I'd forgotten, about his hopes for the future, which were more modest now, but somehow more substantial. As the evening wound down, Liam helped me clear the table, a small gesture that spoke volumes. In all the years I'd known him, he'd never once offered to help with dishes or cleanup. Those were invisible tasks, women's work, beneath his notice. I never thanked you, he said as he dried a wine glass. For paying my college tuition that year, Dad's business was struggling. I nearly dropped the plate I was washing. You knew about that. Dad told me, years later. Said you'd insisted it be kept quiet to protect his pride. That's true. James was a proud man. It was important to him to feel like he was providing for his children. But the reality was, you were the one doing the providing, at least some of the time, and none of us ever acknowledged that. We never even saw it. I rinsed the last dish and handed it to him. It was a choice I made, Liam, to be invisible in that way. I never regretted it because I loved your father. And I loved you kids. But it did come at a cost I didn't fully understand until recently. The cost of being seen for who you really are. I nodded. Exactly. As he was leaving, Liam paused at the front door. Noah and Emma were talking about maybe stopping by sometime, if that's okay with you. They're nervous, but they miss you. I felt a flutter of something not quite forgiveness, not yet, but a willingness to see where this road might lead. Tell them my door is open, I said, but they need to come ready for honesty, not just reconciliation. I'll tell them. He hesitated, then leaned in and kissed my cheek, a gesture so reminiscent of the boy he'd once been that my heart ached. Thank you, Pamela, for dinner, for listening, for giving me a second chance. You're welcome, Liam. I watched him walk to his car, not the luxury sedan Ava had insisted on, but a modest used Honda that probably cost less than one of her handbags. As his taillights disappeared down the street, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope, not for the family we'd been, which had been built on illusions and false assumptions, but for the family we might become, grounded in truth and mutual respect. The next day, I received a text message from Emma. Liam said your door is open. Would next Sunday for coffee be okay? And another from Noah. I owe you an apology. Many apologies. Can we talk sometime? I responded to both with the same simple message, yes. Not I forgive you, or everything's fine, because neither was entirely true yet. But yes to the possibility of rebuilding. Yes to the chance to know each other as we really were. Yes to a future that might be richer and more honest than our past had ever been. That night, as I sat in James's favorite chair, my favorite chair, now I found myself talking to him as if he were still there. They're growing up, James. Finally. It took losing everything they thought they had to realize what actually matters. I wish you could see it. I wish you could see me, too, the real me, stepping into the light after all these years in the shadows. I could almost hear his laugh, see the twinkle in his eyes that had first drawn me to him all those years ago. I think you'd be proud, I whispered. Of them, and maybe even of me, for finding the strength to be myself at last. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It was full of memories, good and bad, and possibilities for a future I was just beginning to imagine. A future where I was no longer the invisible woman, supporting everyone else from the shadows, but Pamela Roberts, seen and valued for exactly who I was. Emma arrived for coffee on Sunday precisely 10 minutes early, a habit she'd inherited from her father. She stood on my doorstep clutching a small gift bag, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. I didn't know what to bring, she confessed as I invited her in. Wine seemed inappropriate for coffee, flowers felt insufficient, and I couldn't think of anything that would adequately say, "I'm sorry I was a terrible stepdaughter who helped throw you out of your own house." I couldn't help but smile at her bluntness. "Coffee with you is enough, Emma. But thank you for the thought." She handed me the bag anyway. Inside was a small, elegant silver photo frame holding a picture I'd never seen before, James and me at Emma's college graduation, his arm around my waist, both of us beaming with pride. "I found it when I was going through some old albums," Emma explained. "It struck me that you look so happy there, so yourself. And I realized I never really saw that back then. I was too caught up in my own life to notice that you were a whole person, not just my father's wife." It was an insightful observation, and one that suggested Emma had been doing some serious reflection since our last encounter. We settled in the sunroom with coffee and the cranberry scones I'd baked that morning. For a while, we talked about safe topics: the weather, her studies, the changes in the neighborhood. But eventually, as I'd known it would, the conversation turned to more difficult terrain. "I owe you an apology," Emma said, setting down her coffee cup. "What we did, what I helped do, was inexcusable. I let Ava's resentment and my own greed cloud my judgment. I forgot that you were grieving too, that you just lost your husband, my father. I was so focused on what I thought we were entitled to that I never stopped to consider what you might be going through. It was a good apology, specific, taking full responsibility, acknowledging the harm done, but I needed to know if she understood the deeper issue." "Why do you think I never told any of you about my financial situation?" I asked. "About the properties, the investments, my life before I met your father." Emma thought for a moment, really thought, her brow furrowed in concentration. I think maybe you were protecting Dad's pride. He always wanted to be the provider, the successful one. If everyone knew you were the one with the real money, it might have made him feel diminished somehow. That was part of it," I acknowledged. "James and I had an understanding, in public. He was the successful businessman, and I was his supportive wife. It made him happy, and I loved him enough to play that role. But there was more to it, wasn't there?" I nodded, impressed by her perceptiveness. "I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had. I'd been through that once before, with friends who disappeared after my first husband died and the money was gone. When I met your father, I was careful about who knew about my assets. I wanted to be sure he loved me for me." "And he did," Emma said softly. "Yes, he did. James never cared about my money. If anything, he was sometimes uncomfortable with how much I had. But he respected me enough to let me manage my own affairs, and I respected him enough to let him feel like the provider for the family, even when I was supplementing his income behind the scenes." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "And we never saw any of that. We just saw what we expected to see: Dad as the breadwinner, you as the second wife who had it easy. People usually do see what they expect to see." I said, "It's human nature, but that doesn't excuse what we did." "No, it doesn't, but it helps explain it." Emma reached across the table and took my hand, her eyes filling with tears. "I am so sorry, Pamela. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am truly, deeply sorry for how we treated you, for not seeing you, for not valuing you as a person, not just as Dad's wife." I squeezed her hand, feeling my own eyes grow damp. "Thank you, Emma. That means a lot." We talked for hours that afternoon, really talked, perhaps for the first time since I'd married her father. She told me about her struggles to find her place in the business world, about how she'd always felt like she was trying to live up to an ideal that didn't fit her. I shared stories about my first marriage, about building my business in a time when women weren't taken seriously in real estate, about falling in love with James despite our different backgrounds. By the time she left, something had shifted between us. Not forgiveness. Exactly, that would take more time, more conversations, more evidence of change. But understanding, perhaps a foundation upon which something new might be built. Noah was next, arriving the following Wednesday with a bottle of wine and a sheepish expression that reminded me so much of James that my heart clenched. "I've rehearsed what to say a dozen times," he admitted as we sat in the living room, "and it still doesn't seem adequate." "Start with the truth," I suggested. "That's usually the best place." He took a deep breath. "The truth is, I was jealous. Dad always said I was the most like him, the businessman, the practical one. I built my whole identity around being his successor, carrying on his legacy. And then when he died, and the will was read, and it turned out there wasn't much of a legacy to carry on, I felt like I'd lost not just my father, but my whole sense of self." It was a startlingly honest admission, one that revealed more self-awareness than I'd given Noah credit for. "That must have been painful," I said. "It was. But it doesn't excuse how I treated you. I let my disappointment turn into resentment, and I took it out on the wrong person. You were never the problem, Pamela. If anything, you were supporting us in ways we never knew about or appreciated." "That's true," I said, not harshly, but matter-of-factly. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "Liam told me that you paid for his college tuition one year. Did you ever help me without my knowing?" I considered whether to tell him, then decided honesty was the only way forward. "Yes, when you were trying to buy your first house, and the bank wouldn't approve the full mortgage amount you needed, James was worried you'd lose the house you'd set your heart on, but he didn't have the cash to help. So I made a quiet donation to your down payment fund." Noah looked stunned. "The anonymous gift, the one we thought came from Dad's old college roommate. That was my idea. Actually, James didn't want you to feel like you were accepting charity, especially from your stepmother. So instead, you let us think it came from someone else, and never took any credit." I shrugged. "It wasn't about credit. It was about helping someone I cared about." Noah was quiet for a long time, processing this revelation. "I've been so wrong about you, Pamela. We all have." "You saw what you expected to see," I said, echoing my words to Emma. "And I played the role I thought would make everyone's lives easier. We all share some responsibility for the misunderstandings. But not for what happened after Dad died," Noah insisted. "That's entirely on us, on me. I let my grief and disappointment justify treating you with contempt. I didn't stop Ava when she said those terrible things. I didn't defend you, even though I knew what she was doing was wrong." "No, you didn't," I agreed, and that hurt more than I can express. I wish I could go back and change it. "We can't change the past, Noah, but we can decide what kind of future we want to build." He looked at me with an expression that reminded me of Liam in the hospital, vulnerable, hopeful, afraid of rejection but desperate for connection. "Do you think there's a way forward for us? Some path to, I don't want to say forgiveness, because that feels like asking too much, but to some kind of relationship?" I thought about James, about what he would want for his family. I thought about the decades I'd spent playing a role, being less than I was to make others comfortable. I thought about the clarity I'd found in the months since his death, the strength I'd discovered in myself. "Yes," I said finally. "I think there's a way forward, but it has to be based on truth this time. No more roles, no more assumptions, just real people trying to build real connections." "I'd like that," Noah said quietly. "I'd like to get to know the real Pamela Roberts." "She's quite something," I said with a small smile. "Once you get to know her." When Noah left that evening, he hugged me, something he'd rarely done in all the years I'd known him. It was an awkward embrace, but sincere, the beginning of a new way of relating to each other. Over the next few weeks, a new pattern emerged. Liam would come for dinner once a week, usually bringing something from the community garden project his nonprofit had started. Emma would stop by for coffee on Sunday afternoons, sometimes bringing a book she thought I'd enjoy or asking my advice about a teaching challenge. Noah would call every few days, gradually opening up about his struggles with the consulting firm, eventually asking if I would consider being a silent partner in a new venture he was planning. Slowly, tentatively. We were building something new from the ashes of the family we thought we were. Not perfect, not without moments of tension or misunderstanding, but real in a way our previous relationships had never been. And as for me, Pamela Morrison Roberts, I was finally stepping fully into the light. No longer the invisible woman making everything work from behind the scenes, but a full participant in my own life, seen and valued for exactly who I was. 6 months after Noah's first visit, I hosted a dinner party at my home. Not the formal, strained affairs we used to have when James was alive, but a relaxed gathering of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Liam brought his new girlfriend, Sarah, a dedicated social worker with a warm laugh and no pretensions. Emma came with a fellow teacher whose passion for education matched her own. Noah arrived with his teenage daughter, Lily, who had recently started spending weekends with him since his divorce. As I looked around the table at these people, my family, though not in the way I had once defined that word, I felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with money or status or playing a role. This was real. These connections were built on truth and mutual respect, not assumptions or obligations. Later, as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Lily approached me somewhat shyly. "Grandma Pam," she says, using the name she'd spontaneously given me a few weeks earlier. "Dad says you own a bunch of buildings in New York. Is that true?" I smiled, no longer feeling any need to downplay my success. "Yes, I do. I've been investing in real estate for over 40 years. That's really cool. I'm thinking about studying business in college, maybe real estate development. Would you maybe tell me about it sometime?" I felt a surge of emotion, pride, hope, a sense of continuity I hadn't expected to feel again after James died. "I'd like that very much, Lily. In fact, I'm going to New York next month to check on some properties. Maybe you'd like to come with me. See the business firsthand." Her eyes widened. "Really, that would be amazing," from across the room. I caught Noah watching us, a look of wonder on his face. He raised his glass slightly in a silent toast, acknowledging something we both understood now, that family isn't defined by blood or legal ties, but by choice, by showing up, by seeing each other clearly and choosing to connect anyway. That evening, as the last guests were leaving, Liam hung back, helping me gather dishes despite my protests. "This feels good," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room, "like family, but better somehow." "Better because it's real," I replied. "We're not playing roles anymore. We're just being ourselves. And it turns out that's enough," he said softly. "More than enough." As I closed the door behind him, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months, perhaps even years. The woman in the mirror was no longer just James's widow, no longer the invisible force making everything work while taking no credit. She was Pamela Roberts, strong, capable, generous, but not to be taken for granted, willing to forgive but unwilling to be diminished. The invisible woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth, someone who could choose forgiveness or distance, engagement or solitude, based on what felt right rather than what was expected. And that, I reflected as I turned out the lights and headed upstairs, was worth more than $47 million. Though the $47 million didn't hurt. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.